Hello, and welcome back to Off the Deaton Path. I'm your host, Stan Deaton, with the Georgia Historical Society, and we welcome you to this podcast for the week of February 13th, 2025. We are coming to you this week from the Parts and Service Department here at the Georgia Historical Society on the 15th floor of the Jepson House overlooking beautiful Forsyth Park in downtown Savannah. My very special guest today is author and architect Witold Rybczynski, who joins me to talk about his new book on the design history of the car. Witold Rybczynski is the Martin and Margie Meyerson Professor Emeritus of Urbanism at the University of Pennsylvania, where he taught classes in design and development, architectural theory, and a freshman seminar on contemporary architecture. Witold has designed and built houses as a registered architect, as well as doing practical experiments in low-cost housing, which took him to Mexico, Central America, Nigeria, Tanzania, India, the Philippines, and China. He holds bachelor's and master's degrees in architecture, both from McGill University, where he also taught for 20 years. He contributes regularly on architecture and urbanism to the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, and is architecture critic for the online magazine Slate. He is the author of many acclaimed books, including Home, A Short History of an Idea, published by Viking in 1986 and translated into 10 languages. The Most Beautiful House in the World, published by Viking in 1989. A Clearing in the Distance, Frederick Law Olmsted and America in the 19th Century, a biography of Frederick Law Olmsted, published by Scribner in 1999, and winner of the J. Anthony Lucas Prize. One Good Turn, A Natural History of the Screwdriver and the Screw, published by Scribner in 2000. The Perfect House, A Journey with Renaissance master Andrea Palladio, published by Scribner in 2002. How Architecture Works, A Humanist Toolkit, published by FSG in 2013. Mysteries of the Mall and Other Essays, published by FSG in 2015. Now I Sit Me Down, From Klezmos to Plastic Chair, A Natural History, which was a history of the chair, published by FSG in 2016. Charleston Fancy, Little Houses and Big Dreams in the Holy City, published by Yale University Press in 2019. The Story of Architecture, published by Yale in 2022, and the one he's here to talk about with me today, entitled The Driving Machine, A Design History of the Car, published by W.W. Norton on October 8, 2024. The book was reviewed in the Wall Street Journal on October 4th and in Car and Driver on October 8th. It is a fascinating, informed, and fun book to read. My conversation with renowned architect Witold Rybczynski begins now. Witold Rybczynski, welcome to our podcast.
Hi, Stan. It's a pleasure to be here.
You have written a book about the car, and the subtitle is A Design History of the Car. This is not a social history of the car or an economic history of the car, but it reflects your lifelong interest, I think, as an architect. It seems safe to say that you are fascinated by how things work, how they're designed, and what that design is a reflection of. Is that fair?
Yes, I think so. I've written mostly about buildings in terms of design, but I have written a book about chairs, for example, and also a book about sort of tools. So the cars was not completely kind of out of left field, and of course there's a huge difference between buildings and cars because of course cars move, which. But cars are a consumer product, and buildings are not really a consumer product, which means that if people don't like a car, it kind of goes away. And I talk about some of those examples. Whereas if you don't like a building, you're kind of stuck with it, and it isn't going away. It may go away eventually if people don't keep it up well or restore it or decide they want to tear it down. And we're seeing some of those ugly concrete buildings of the 60s are sort of don't do well with the public. But generally speaking, buildings have a very long life and cars don't. So one of the, I think, reasons for writing the book at least in my head, was that I wanted to treat cars seriously the way we treat buildings, the way historians treat buildings, I should say. And because they're important artifacts, and actually a lot of man hours go into a car. As much really effort goes into a car, the design of a car, as the design of a building. But because they disappear, we sort of forget them, and we sometimes see them in movies. But basically, I mean, I've never, for instance, driven in or driven a Ford Model T or many of the older cars I read about. Other than maybe a car museum, I I'm not a kind of car show goer, but I
Hmm.
have been to a couple of car museums since I wrote the book, and it's a sort of treat to see the cars. But of course, they're not moving, and you're not driving them, so I don't really know what it's like to drive, for instance, a car from the 30s. It's a car without power steering and all the things that we sort of get used to, and or a car like the Model T, which really didn't have a body in the sense of you weren't enclosed, you were in the
Hmm.
weather.
Right, right.
And you see sometimes pictures of people bundled up in these early cars because they didn't have heating and they didn't actually have a kind of box. You were out in the elements.
Hmm. Well, you've touched on so many different things there that I want to talk to you about in this time we have together. But I was going to ask you about the relationship between cars and buildings, and I want to read this quote. This is really from your preface. You say cars, unlike buildings, have a relatively short life. In most states, a 25-year-old vehicle is eligible for an antique license plate. Buildings, on the other hand, last for centuries. You can still walk into the lobby of the Chrysler building on Lexington Avenue in Manhattan, but you will not find a Chrysler Airflow parked on your street.
Yes,
I
yes.
love that. I love that. And why is that? Why is that? What is in the nature of the car? And you touch on this that we don't drive cars that look like they did in the 1930s anymore. Our buildings and our houses, arguably, can still be made to look like those that were built nearly 100 years ago. But something about cars, we don't even see 1970s cars on the road today. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, in fact, in the last few decades, there have been sort of car revivals. I mean, I'm thinking of the Mini that BMW came out with, or
Hmm.
Fiat came
Hmm.
out with a Fiat 500, which dates back to the 40s, I think, late
Hmm.
40s. Um, and so there's a third one which I'm blanking on right now, but uh, so there have been some attempts, and um, I think I'm not sure. One of the things about cars is that they don't have a history. I mean, the first car is 1885. Carl Benz makes this funny looking contraption,
Hmm.
but they don't have an ancient history. Architecture does, so there's a kind of deep roots all the way back to ancient Rome and Greece in the case of, say, American public buildings. Whereas
Hmm.
cars don't have that. So I think people are used to the notion that a new car is going to look different year by year. And of course, there is this uh, there's I would say, a marketing strategy which really General Motors developed first. And that was get people to buy a car every few years, because if you're
Hmm.
making cars, that's what you want. You don't want to hold on to the car for long. So there's a big one of the big differences is with the Mercedes built cars that were meant to last 20 to 30 years. And they of course cost more because everything was more durable. Whereas the American approach tended to be get people to replace the car ideally every few years. And so this whole idea of, for instance, a car of having a car shows and annual models, that was an American invention. The
Hmm.
Europeans weren't, partly because they weren't selling enough cars back in the day, and so the models would hang around for maybe 10 years, 12 years. Whereas an American car, often the models would get changed every few years, and even every year there would be sort of cosmetic changes made to the car so it looked different than the previous year. And I think people got used to that, and they didn't expect cars to look the same over long periods. Whereas with buildings. I mean, I'm in a building that's more than 100 years old. It was originally a warehouse. Now it's a condominium. So,
Hmm.
uh, and of course, Philadelphia is an old city, and as I mean, it's older than Atlanta, but even Atlanta has older buildings, and we're sort of used to cities with buildings that we experience them as children, and then they're still there when we're grown up.
Hmm.
And cars
Hmm.
are not like that.
And yet, if a 1930s Chrysler Arrow were to drive down the street, it of course would get a lot of attention, in part because of that. They're seen as classics. Um, and I'm going to ask you about Harley Earl and Alfred P. Sloan because you mentioned General Motors and all the dynamic things that they did. Um, you talk about the fact that one of the reasons that you were drawn to writing about cars is you like well-designed tools. You have written about the screwdriver and the screw and chairs. In fact, you say, using a well-designed tool, I feel connected to the past, whether I am swinging a hammer or sitting behind a steering wheel. Talk about that for a little bit, if you will.
Well, when I wrote this my book about tools, I mean, there's a whole story behind it, which I won't go into here. But one of the things about it was that I was surprised that most tools are ancient. I mean, the hammer, for the claw hammer, is a Roman tool because the Romans
Hmm.
invented nails, and they needed a thing to pull out nails as well as hammer them. And the claw hammer, we've been using that for 2,000 years.
Hmm.
And so when you're hammering a nail, you're doing something almost ancient. And I mean, screws date from roughly the Middle Ages. Uh, but it goes on and on like that. A lot of tools are Egyptian, ancient Egyptian. And so if you're using a tool, especially a tool that's been around or has been refined, like the automobile, the first automobiles, the truth is we couldn't drive them because the controls are all different than what we're used to. They had hand throttles instead of pedals, and you change gears differently, and the whole thing is very different. And I do talk in the book about how, I mean, starting a Ford Model T was a whole procedure. It wasn't easy. You didn't just press a button the way we do. And
Hmm.
so uh, cars and any tools, they're the result of this long process of refinement. And of course, with cars, it changes more. But when you think about, there's one kind of charming element that stuck around, which is the rear view mirror. We haven't figured out a better way to do it, and that's very old. It's been around a long time, but
Hmm.
somehow it works. And you can get an electric car from Tesla, but it still has a rear view mirror,
Hmm.
and it's just an effective thing. And so. Uh, I've always been sort of interested in tools because they do have this history, and when they're good, when they've been refined and when they work well, it really becomes like an extension of your body. When you use a well-designed German camera, for instance, nobody uses cameras anymore, but when I was growing up, of course, as an
Hmm.
architect, I needed a camera, and that was always a pleasure because it was everything. It wasn't designed to be looked at. It was the controls were right where you wanted them, and when the shutter and everything like that.
Hmm.
Uh, Even old telephones. I'm not a fan of smartphones because there's just this kind of pack of cards. Doesn't fit your hand particularly well. It doesn't fit your ear. And I'm old enough to have grown up with the Bell telephone phones that were the beautiful. It's very sculptural, but it's all worked out. Even the dial was worked out so that it
Hmm.
actually worked, and then you could
Hmm.
you could sort of tuck the phone under your shoulder. Yes,
Sure. Yeah.
now you
Cradle
see
it.
it in
Hmm.
old movies,
Oh yeah. Yeah. No,
uh,
I,
but it's
the
a
belt
much
was
more
the.
beautifully designed tool. I mean, I
Hmm.
I appreciate the advantages of smartphones, but I don't like it as a physical tool.
Hmm.
It's sort of but of course, it only lasts a few years. That's the other part I don't particularly like. I think one of the nice thing about tools, see, if you have a hammer, you never throw a hammer away because it never
Hmm.
really, you might replace the handle at one point. But there's something very nice about having a tool that you've had your whole life.
Hmm.
And that we'll never say that about a smartphone because
No.
they don't last long enough.
I know. I've talked about this with people. I've got shoes that are over 40 years old, loafers. But if you have a cell phone that's more than 3 or 4 years old, you get laughed at now. People are like, "Oh, you're
That's
carrying
true.
around this dinosaur."
Yes.
Um, One of the things about cars, and one of the things about your book that makes it so charming, in addition to being so informative and so interesting, is that you talk about your own cars, right? The 15 cars I think that you said you've owned over 5 decades. The first, which was a 1960 VW Beetle. But you say right off that you are not one of these people who feels like romantically attached to your car. But at the same time, there is something about driving. You touch on this near the end of your book. There's something about being behind the wheel of a car and driving down the road that has always done something to us, not just Americans, but all over the world. There's something about that.
Yes, there is. And it's I mean it's partly the freedom, the idea that you can go where you want and you can change your mind and it's like you're totally in charge. I mean, unless something really goes wrong, and then most of us are not in charge because we don't really understand how everything works. But it
Mhm.
does give you this sense of freedom. I mean, I was surprised, for instance, all the early automobile pioneers raced cars. I mean, they built cars and sold cars, but they were all racers. Henry Ford
Hmm.
was a racer. He actually had the world's land speed record at one point. And so they were all businessmen. And I mean, the ones who survived were good businessmen, but they all were attracted to racing. I mean, uh, the builder of the Porsche who built the Volkswagen built racing cars as well and raced them. They
Hmm.
were there was this attraction also to speed. It was something, especially at the first day of the early days of cars. Nobody ever moved at that kind of, the fastest you could go would be on a fast horse or a carriage.
Hmm.
But which, and I finished at the end of the book. I quote from Henry James of one of his novels, and that there's a sense that even riding a horse and carriage had that same feeling of speed and freedom and kind of being in charge of things, and also more so, I think, with the horse and carriage. But there was a sense of a kind of a skill. You were you were making decisions and being skillful about it in handling the car. It's not a huge skill unless you're be talking about a racing car driver, but it's still a kind of skill that you have to do. You have to make decisions, and your hands and feet and eye all have to work together. So there's some kind of satisfaction, I think, in doing all that. Uh, so you're quite right. It's not an American thing. It's really you see the same thing, and of course it explains the global popularity of the car. I mean, it's not it's a device that's certainly not. I mean, at one point it was a Western device, but then it became. I mean, there are more cars in China now than there are here, and they're also good at making cars. So it sort of spread really with prosperity. Once people were prosperous enough, they all appreciated that the freedom that you could move things around and your family and objects and so on. So the cars gave you all that.
Hmm.
Which is
Uh,
why I think it's not going to go away. I'm not one of those dark prophets who thinks. I mean, the engines will change, and God knows
hmm.
how it'll be powered. It might be powered by hydrogen or who knows what.
Hmm.
But that whole experience is going to it's sort of too good to give up. Or if we give it up, it'll be like the last thing we give up because it's just too useful and too pleasurable.
Hmm. one of the things you did in this book was it has 106, excuse me, 106 black and white illustrations of the cars that you are talking about, drawn by the author. You did that. I wanted to ask you about that because they are indispensable to sort of taking your reader by the hand rather than showing photographs or whatever. You've got these wonderful drawings. You're a trained architect. I was going to ask you, did you enjoy doing that? Did you have to talk your publisher into letting you do that? And was that the most fun about this book?
I don't know if it was it was fun. It was definitely enjoyable. And it was done. I mean, as I wrote, I drew. So it also had to do with getting a better understanding of the car, because when you
Hmm.
draw something, it really sinks into your head in some strange way that I don't understand, but it's definitely the case. And so it wasn't that I wrote the book and then did all the drawings. I did them as I wrote.
Mm.
I had done this before with the chair book, and I think part of it is purely technical. As the books I write are trade books, which means they're not printed on glossy paper, and if I was to use photographs, they would be sort of grainy black and white photographs, and not particularly useful in communicating. But there are I think, two other things about the drawings is that when you draw, you can decide what to show and what not to show. So you can make a drawing more um, a better explainer of something than a photograph. A photograph just shows you everything. And whereas a drawing, you can decide to emphasize certain things and leave out certain things. And so if you get a complicated thing, like especially the older cars, they're the hardest thing was the new cars because they're sort of smooth and sculptural, and the old cars have spokes and all these interesting things.
Hmm.
The other thing that I realized actually at the end is by drawing them, you sort of make all the cars part of a huge family because they're all drawn. So whether it's a Tesla or a Model T, they're drawn the same way, and it kind of links them together rather than if you use photographs, the old cars are sort of kind of old, funny, antique photographs, and then the new
Hmm.
cars are very glossy and always in color. And it kind of separates them rather than brings them together because they're all cars and they all have four wheels, or some of them have three wheels, but most of them have four
Right.
wheels. And so there's a kind of they're all recognizably part of the same kind of family of objects. And the drawings emphasize that, I think.
I was going to ask you about how you did the research for this book because I have read some of your blog posts, and you talk about one of the things you always enjoyed as a professor of writing your books, even if you were writing for a popular audience, was you liked going into the archives. You liked going into the library and pulling down books and doing the kind of research in the sources. And I'm guessing for this book, your research was very different. How did you become familiar with cars, some of which are, as you mentioned, well over 100 years old?
What I did a lot of the research online because what I found really useful is there's all these YouTube videos of people driving old cars. And I've never driven in a Model T, but there are YouTube videos of people driving them. You can see, shifting is a whole kind of
Mm-hmm.
manual work, and starting the car, and so you get a good sense of with the older cars of what it's like, what they must have been like to be in them. And I actually didn't go to car museums because they're sort of like chair museums. I think it's kind of pointless. You can look at the car, but they won't allow you to sit inside it, and of course you
Right.
can't drive it. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's a very kind of minimal experience. Because when you go to a museum and look at paintings, you're looking at the painting, which is what you were supposed to do in the first place. You don't own the painting, but you can
Mm-hmm.
look at it just like people have always done. So uh, I tended to focus, I suppose, to some extent on the cars I owned partly because some of them at least I found interesting in terms of design, but at least I had driven them, so I had a kind of connection to them, whereas the other cars were kind of more distant. Um, I don't think I didn't really see the book as a research project in as much as some of my other books. I think it was partly a memoir, and when you get to my age, you kind of look back as much as looking forward. There isn't much forward to look to compared to looking back, and so uh, part of it I think was I had owned all these cars, and uh, I wasn't a car enthusiast. I did read Car and Driver magazine, but I wasn't a car enthusiast. I'd never been to a car show. I mean, I didn't sort of have an emotional attachment. I read recently of people giving names to their cars, which I found the most weird thing. It would never occur to me to name my car. But uh, so part of the book was kind of a memoir looking back and like what was really going on there? What did it all add up to? And why did these things sort of occupy a big part of my life? Because of course cars are expensive for most of us. Other than where we live, our house or apartment, they're the most expensive objects we buy. So it's a kind of major investment of things, and so that the story behind them kind of interested me. I mean, I had bought that Volkswagen you mentioned, was my first car in Germany. I bought it in a used car in Germany when I was just graduated, and but I didn't know any of the story behind it. So it was partly also I was just interested in knowing, where did it come from? Uh, one of the we sort of take cars for granted. They show up and then that's the car, but there's a whole story behind it, and also behind the bits and pieces that go into the car. But
Mm-hmm.
they're not all invented at once, and they're not all invented by the same people, and there's a kind of trial and error, and so and at the end of the book, I also realized, because one of the things that when you get to my age is you realize that you've had an experience that nobody else is going to have. I mean, your generation has had an experience that's unique. I mean, if I was older, I maybe would have had a Model T at one point. I mean, I wouldn't be alive if I had a Model T. Uh, but what I mean is that both in architecture and in cars, there's you realize that you've had a kind of unique experience that I don't say that was the golden age of cars, but it was a certain kind of car. I mean, it made noise. I'm not attracted by electric cars. They're too quiet. I mean, there's nothing, and they're incredibly fast. So they're very kind of super efficient, but the kind of the excitement that you got from a car in the past, like the little Mini Cooper I had, when you hit about 60 miles an hour, the carburetors kind of roared, and it was all very exciting. Of course, I was I was in my 20s at that point. So,
Mm-hmm.
but that was part of the book. I think it was a kind of looking back on this without going, not in a sort of heavy-handed way, but it was for me a looking back and realizing that this period, the sort of post-war period up to probably the 80s, was a particular period in cars where, and we're now at the beginning of something else. The car has really changed,
Mm-hmm.
and it's going to keep changing, and who knows where it will go. But it's clearly a new kind of thing. It's not the same thing as the cars that I experienced. Because as I pointed out in the book, uh, in my life with cars, you never thought about getting into a strange car like that you needed some instruction. I mean, any car, you just turned the key and you knew where everything was, and you didn't need, if you rented a car or if somebody lent you a car, you simply got in and drove, and that you can't do that anymore. I mean, I don't
Hmm.
know what I would do if I got into a Tesla as a driver. I wouldn't know where to start. Somebody would have to explain things to me,
Hmm.
and it's a different animal. It does things, arguably does better things. Whether it's safer, I'm not so sure, but look, staring at a television screen while you're driving doesn't strike me as particularly safe. But
I
uh,
agree completely. Yeah.
but again, some of this is just kind of an old man complaining about the future that he doesn't understand.
Well, I will say, you confess to that here, but in reading the book, I was well aware of how old you were as I read the book, because you tell the reader, and you don't come across at all in the book as somebody who says, God, the best things were 50 years ago. You're very open about the possibility of electric cars, and in fact, some of the very first cars in the beginning of the 20th century were electric. They started there, I think,
That's right. Yeah.
and so we're sort of going back to that partly out of necessity, right, with fossil fuels. But one of the things I want to ask you about, I was amazed at, and if you read the book and you don't know anything about cars, you will enjoy it and have a great time going along. But I thought, wow, this is a guy who knows his way around under the hood and under the chassis. You know all the different parts of the car and how they work. So I was astonished to hear you say, and I'm quoting, I'm not particularly adept mechanically. I can change the oil and replace spark plugs or a fan belt, but that's about the limit of my competence. How did you learn? Because you describe as we go along the technological innovations, what this person did, what that person did in the design, and the way the car drove. And you talk about mechanically how they operate.
Well, I mean, I went to a Jesuit school, so while I learned Latin, we did not have shop, or or I know there were high schools, certainly in the United States, and I think in Canada where I went to school,
Hmm.
where you could learn about car maintenance. That was like a class you could take, and I wish I had that, but I didn't. So I was my sort of ability was pretty limited as I write. I could change the oil and do things like that, but um, I think at one point I just had to. I think it was my editor at one point said, it would be useful to explain some of these various technical terms when they come up. And I realized that I use words like carburetor, but I didn't actually know what a carburetor did. So it was a question of learning a bit of what does a carburetor do, and what are disc brakes actually. I mean, I always
Hmm.
knew they were better that they were sort of improvement on other brakes, but it did take some research to sort of teach myself a little bit about how these various aspects of the car actually worked. I'm still not somebody who can explain completely how an internal combustion engine works, for instance. My father was an electrical engineer, but electricity is just a mystery to me. I just don't
Yeah.
understand it. And it is a bit. It's not a huge part of cars, but there's a part of it, and of course, it was a very important. The electric starter was one of the great sort of breakthroughs in car design,
Hmm.
because until then you had to crank it by hand, which was both dangerous, very physically very strenuous, and it basically guaranteed that women couldn't drive because it was much more than most women could do. That you really had to crank it hard. So when the electric starter comes along, it also opens the car up to women drivers. And I heard this funny story, which after I wrote the book, or I would have included it, and it was about Henry Ford and his when he was doing well, and his wife wanted a car, but she insisted they had to be an electric car because that didn't have a crank, and so it appealed to women, and there were many women who drove electric cars. There was electric cars in the White House for the first ladies, and but electric cars were about 3 times the cost of a Model T, and Henry Ford was very upset about this, but his wife insisted, and he had to buy her every few years a new electric car, even though it was more than the cars that he manufactured. And of course, eventually the electric starter comes along, and then it becomes a car that everybody can drive.
You mentioned that you went to school in Canada. You were born in Edinburgh in the middle
Yeah.
of World War II. You grew up, I think, in London. Went to school in Montreal, I think. Did your parents have a car at any point as you were growing up?
Uh, Not in England. I think my father was on a waiting list. England in the 1950s was really terribly affected by the war. There were still rationing, there were shortages. And so I think he was on a waiting list for a car. Although we never had a car in England, but once we got to Canada, you could buy a car. I mean, there were used cars. And so we always had cars pretty much from the very beginning. I was 10 years old when we emigrated to Canada. And what was funny and unusual, I suppose, and kind of probably affected my experience of cars is that we always had English cars because Canada was part of the British Commonwealth, and England exported cars to the Commonwealth, which didn't necessarily ever make it to the United States. The United States had, of course, a huge car industry of its own, and I don't think they were smallish cars. They wouldn't have appealed, but my father by then they'd lived in England about 10 years. And so they were quite Anglophile. And so the first cars we had were all English cars. There was a Vauxhall and an English Ford. And so the European sort of connection was something I grew up with, which is why, as I mentioned in the book, I've only actually owned one American-made car. It was a GMC Jimmy. And it wasn't, I don't know whether it was just sort of, it wouldn't have occurred to me to buy an American car. They were large. They weren't actually very interesting cars from a design point of view. And when I'm talking now about the 60s and 70s,
Right.
I mean, there's the great American period, it seems to me, is the 30s. There's some wonderfully designed American cars, and the big difference, I think, is that it's the time when engineers designed cars, and then there's a moment when the stylist appears, and it all shifts, and whereas the engineered cars lasted much longer in Europe than they did here, partly because the companies were started by engineers. All the including here, Ford and Chrysler, they were mechanics, and later on they were engineers as they went to school, and so the car was seen as an engineered object, and there were people who dealt with the body, but that was very much at the end of the process, whereas it gets reversed at one point, and you start with the stylist. And then the poor engineer has to figure out how to make the thing run and squeeze a motor in and so on. But the styling comes first.
And one of the things that I think has also worked so well in this book is it really has an international flavor to it. As you just mentioned, you were more at home, I think, with what we would consider European or British cars. And so you talk about from the very beginning, side by side with Ford, talking about Carl Benz and Daimler and Porsche, and talk about the cars were developed in Italy and France and of course Germany and in England, and all the way through the book. I mean, all the way through you talk about up to including, of course, Japanese cars in the 1970s and 80s, which were also fascinating. And in fact, you say, I think it's something to the effect of cars really have been a reflection of our national character.
At the beginning, there's a moment when they become global products. And then it does change. But at the beginning, yes, the French, I mean, some of the French companies are some of the oldest car companies in the world. The Europeans, of course, were there first. We think of Henry Ford and this incredible achievement of the assembly line. But it's not the invention of the car. The car is European cars predate American cars,
Mhm.
and uh, they the French people drove French cars, and they didn't like German cars, and there were also habits. I mean, the Swedes had a rough climate, so they developed cars that could really deal with really cold weather, and then their French cars, for instance, always have to have four doors. I don't know why, but that's what the market wanted in France. Whereas in Germany, the Volkswagen has only two doors,
Mhm.
and the small cars were two doors was acceptable. Um, the English cars sort of have a different character almost. So, especially at the beginning, there's definitely a sense that there's a national. I mean, the Americans are selling cars. I mean, Henry Ford, for the sold Model Ts all over Europe, all over the world, South America, Japan. But the Europeans were too small. And so the German cars were sold in Germany and the French cars were sold in France. And the, you don't have a European Common Union yet. It's all, everything's sort of cut up. But that makes it sort of interesting because the French, God bless them, have a totally different approach to cars. I mean, I think it's fascinating, and I loved my deux chevaux, but it's not everything about it was different. It's the way, just their way of thinking, their approach to it, and they tended to be highly well-educated engineers right from the beginning. They had very good engineering schools in France, and so they ended up with sort of just different solutions to the same problem. Some of them, of course, are solutions that everybody adopted. A lot of what makes a sort of modern car in the 30s really comes from French manufacturers.
Mhm.
But yes, there's a kind of national character for the longest time. And I remember I had an uncle and aunt who lived in Paris, and I mean they always had a French car. It wouldn't have occurred to them to buy any other kind of car, and it was and and that's still kind of true today. It's not. It starts to change because the Japanese, of course, are on the other side of the world, and they are going to make cars and they have to sell them to everybody. So then the car starts to become more of a kind of global product, and uh, it loses a kind of national. Not, it still exists today, I suppose, or it used to exist in the sort of high end cars. The handmade Italian cars had it. Although I would say today it's sort of disappointing in a way because I even a Range Rover doesn't look enormously different from a Honda SUV.
Mhm.
They kind of
Mhm.
start to, and I think part of it is globalization. Part of it is you use computers in making bodies. You don't make them out of clay and so on,
Mhm.
which means that there's a kind of homogenization that starts to take place. There's an awful lot of pure styling, which isn't really which an engineer I don't think would do, but which a stylist who's not an engineer. I mean, the engineers are still there, but the
Mhm.
stylist is sort of putting all these folds and creases into the body that are affected more, by, I think, by fashion than anything else. Uh,
Mhm.
and and of course, you do have now schools of car styling. I mean, some of the best ones are in California, and they design cars that are sold all over the world. So, I mean, not just American cars, but they're European manufacturers and even the car companies that it's hard to know what to call Stellantis, for instance. It's got French and Italian and American. And
Mhm.
it's I think the third largest company in the world, but it's you can't really call it a national company. It's just too international to be for that.
Mhm. Well, and you note at one point and we know this, I think that Honda is a Japanese car, but most of them in America are made in Ohio, for instance.
Yes.
So it's, it's
Well, we
exactly what you're
forced them
talking
to
about.
do that, of course. It's not,
Right.
it wasn't
Right.
a choice.
Yeah, it wasn't their choice.
But the actually the history of cars in Japan was also something I didn't know about. And I found it really interesting because
Mm-hmm.
there is a Mr. Honda, or there was a
Right.
Mr.
Right.
Honda,
Yes.
also a car racer, by the way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And Honda, of course, is you sort of saw this back in the very early days of cars, that motorcycle people would graduate and build a small car and become
Mm-hmm.
car manufacturers. And that's, of course, what happened with Honda, but they became a global motorcycle manufacturer and then shifted to small cars and then larger and larger cars. And some of the best engineered cars are Hondas, I think.
And it's interesting because you say really up until about 1963, if you said somebody was driving a Honda, everyone thought and assumed that was a motorcycle. And now, if someone's driving a Honda, it's a CRV or a Civic or an Accord or something like that.
Yes. Yeah.
And shifting around here really quick, I just want to go back real quick to the technologies that you talk about. You mentioned the electric starter. You also talk about the swing axle rear suspension, the famous rack and pinion steering. We mentioned disc brakes earlier. In fact, Richard Snow, who longtime editor of American Heritage Magazine, reviewed your book in the Wall Street Journal, and he talked about he had always sort of bragged about in the early years, his car had rack and pinion steering. But until he read your book, he had no idea really what it meant. Can you explain very quickly what rack and pinion
I
steering
don't
is?
think I can.
Okay.
I don't remember uh, no, I couldn't put it.
And it's perfectly fine. There's a great explanation in your book, and you do that with so much of the technology, which, as I said, is it surprised me when you said I can change the oil, but I can't do the rest of this. But one of the things I do want to talk to you about are the people who changed the way that we think about cars and look at cars, particularly in the 1940s and 50s. I think the American cars had the reputation of being big. These were big cars, and two of the people who were really instrumental in the way cars looked were Alfred P. Sloan and Harley Earl. And particularly Earl said, and I'm going to read a quote here: "My primary purpose for the 28 years that he worked at General Motors has been to lengthen and lower the American automobile, at times in reality and always, at least, in appearance." And you said those two, Sloan and Earl, had a radical effect on American design. What did they do? And why was it so important to make them lower and lengthen them?
Well, Sloan, who was an MIT engineer, took over General Motors, which was not doing well. So he recreated it, but he had very specific ideas partly about how you sold cars and how you manufacture them. So he invented this whole notion of having models every year, new models. His key sort of invention was the notion that you should have a car model for every income group. And so as people, they would start with a more modest car, but as they became richer, they could buy a better General Motors car, a more expensive one. So he ended up with about 6 categories, from a Chevrolet, which was a sort of entry-level car, all the way up to a Cadillac. And the idea was that you wouldn't leave the company. You wouldn't say, "Oh, now I can afford, this car." There would be always a General Motors car, and people got a kind of a loyalty to General Motors or to Ford because they were very much in competition. So that was one of his inventions. The other invention was that he had these divisions making these different cars, but they were totally autonomous. Each one had its own parts and its own kind of assembly line. It was all quite separate, and he realized, well, there's an awful lot of overlap with these cars. There's no reason that each of these cars should make its own electric generators and lamps and everything. And so he promoted this notion of interchangeability. So it was a Chevrolet could have parts from a Pontiac, and a Pontiac could have parts from a Chevrolet, and a Cadillac could have parts from a Pontiac. And so there were, the bodies, of course, looked very different, but there was of course, enormous efficiency in doing all this. Part of his success was Harley Earl, as you mentioned, who initially was brought in as a designer for one of the divisions, but eventually with the backing of Sloan, because they were very much sort of on the same page, the styling section became styling for all the cars. They styled all the cars. They had, and not only did they style all the cars, the styling sort of drove the process. So rather than starting with engineering, you started with styling, and then the engineering came later. And that was, I'm not sure in hindsight that was a good thing in terms of the cars, but it was definitely a good thing in terms of the business of selling cars. And because people got into the habit, and I remember this because when we moved to Canada, which was still was and is influenced by America, so my better off friends, their parents would change cars every few years, and of course my parents, partly because they were immigrants, but partly because they were European, and they simply they didn't have that ethic. I mean, when the car wore out is when you sold it. You didn't, and I think the first several cars we had were all used cars, and then eventually we had, I think, a Honda Accord was probably the first new car they owned. But it was Sloan who kind of created that habit, which Americans took of replacing your car not necessarily every year, but every 2 or 3 years you would replace the car, you would trade it in, but of course you had to have new features. And the styling became one of the features, because it's kind of hard to reinvent the car every 2 years or every year, but you can certainly make it look different. And that's where Earl became actually a key part of the process, because there were new inventions coming along. I mean, air conditioning, power steering, there were a whole series of things, but on top of that, you couldn't just count on that. So you started to get things like tail fins, or what was it, the hard tops. I mean, a number of things that were purely styling rather than. One of the things that I didn't know about that was interesting, that I learned, because you said that I write about Europe and America, is that there's a big difference. There are several differences that account for the difference between American and European cars, and it isn't all culture. Partly because America is a very big country, but mostly flat. Until you hit the Rocky Mountains, it's just a lot of flatness. So we tend to get straight roads, flat, straight roads. The Europeans had a lot of mountains all over Europe, and they had these old roads that were a lot of curvy roads. The Germans had built the autobahns, but the French didn't have anything like that immediately after World War II. So their cars had a different problem. The handling was really a key thing, because you had not long distances. Americans had long distances, so you needed a big car that was comfortable. It didn't have to handle very well because the roads were straight and flat, but it had to be comfortable. And also, we had our own gas. The Europeans didn't have petroleum at that time at all. So gas was more expensive. It was taxed more heavily than here, but it was more expensive. And so the cars tended to be smaller. They handled better because they had to handle better because they had different conditions. And they were, of course, people were less wealthy. I mean, the GNP per capita was much lower, especially in the 50s, right after the war. So the cars were smaller, and all those differences. And the final really big difference was, if you have cars, you have to build roads for the cars. You remember that Henry Ford with the Model T, there were no paved roads.
Hmm.
And you see the Model T was a kind of all-terrain vehicle. When you see old movies,
Hmm.
it's navigating these bad roads. So the question is, how do you pay for the roads? I mean, the drivers should pay for the roads. That's the theory. But
Hmm.
how do you do that? And it's interesting because the Americans said, we'll add taxes to the gasoline. So the more gas you use, the more taxes you pay. So there's a kind of logic to that because it means you're using the roads more. And the
Hmm.
Europeans came up with a different system where you paid an annual tax based on the size of your engine. They said just just as a, I mean, they could have used the weight of the car or something else, but the size of the displacement of the engine was a convenient way to do it.
Hmm.
So what it meant was that if you were a manufacturer, that you would try to make as small an engine as you could, because that way people would pay less, and it was an annual tax, so it was it added up.
Hmm.
And so they got very good at and how do you make a small engine? You have to make the car as light as possible. And so they got very good at doing all that. Whereas in America, you paid it. I mean, the gas was so cheap that people didn't even notice the tax. And so there was no reason to make small engines. The V8, became ultimately the kind of universal engine at one point. And so that's where the design really changes so radically between Europe and, of course, eventually it starts once you get the gas crisis and then you get globalization in manufacturing. It tends to homogenize things. But for the longest time, handling was a European thing and comfort was the American thing, and they were just
Hmm.
two different kind of cars. So people who liked handling tended to go towards European cars when they started to export them. And but people who had to drive long distances on the long, flat, straight roads, you really needed a comfortable car. Driving a windy, sort of noisy little English, say, sports car they weren't made for our distances and
Hmm.
our type of driving.
You talk about how people everywhere became more conscious of being a good gas mileage in 1957 with the Suez Canal crisis, and then, of course, in the 1970s,
Yes.
really, with the OPEC crisis of 73, 74. It's really when you begin to see the Honda come in. The other thing, of course, that's ubiquitous now is the sports utility vehicle, the SUV, which I didn't realize this. You said, when I was growing up, you saw station wagons everywhere in driveways, and then you saw vans, minivans, both of which have really disappeared. You said the last station wagon was manufactured in 1996, which was amazing. I didn't realize those were no
In
longer in
America, by
existence
the
in
way, yeah,
America. Yeah. Hmm.
because the Swedes still like the Swedes and the Germans like station wagons. So if you
Hmm.
want a station wagon today, it's either going to be a Volvo or a Mercedes or an Audi because
Hmm.
they still make them.
Hmm. Hmm.
And they're yes, the station wagon was popular everywhere, but it remains popular. And so it's a purely cultural thing. I don't
Hmm.
understand the SUV phenomenon completely, but it's definitely cultural and not sort of practical or functional. I mean, as I said at the beginning, it's a consumer product. So ultimately, the consumer gets what they want,
Hmm.
and people like the idea. Whether the, I mean, there are many car reviewers and so on. The minivan is a completely sensible car. I mean, much more sensible than an SUV, and yet somehow uh, it had a moment where it took over, and yet sort of people didn't warm up to it. It was seen as, well, as I called it. I mean, one reviewer called it a mom mobile,
Hmm.
and it wasn't a car that a sort of a male driver would like. It certainly compared to all those muscle cars that were so popular. So
Hmm.
but the SUV is now, other than pickup trucks, and I actually I had this bad moment. I finished the book, and then I thought, I really haven't talked about pickup trucks. So I started thinking about it, and I realized you couldn't actually. I was thinking maybe I should just add a chapter. I can do that. But it's too complicated and long a story because the pickup truck starts right at the very beginning. They're Model T pickup trucks. People
Hmm.
are making it themselves aftermarket. But I realized it's just too complicated. You couldn't squeeze it into one chapter. It would almost require its own book because then you have,
Hmm.
the terrorist pickup trucks with machine guns mounted on them. I mean, there's a whole thing going on there, and the different sizes and the extended cab and all of that. So there
Hmm.
was just so I realized I just have to leave them out of the story. But it is actually the most popular vehicle
Hmm.
uh, by
Yeah.
far.
You talk about the 1935. First of all, the Chevy Suburban as a brand has been around now for 90 years, which is incredible. The Chevy Suburban Carryall, 1935, was really the first SUV, and sort of the Land Rover, 1951, which then became, I think, the Range Rover in 1970, and those are
Yeah.
still around, British cars. And all of the highlights are here, the ones you would think about: the Ford Mustang, the Ford Thunderbird, the Corvette, and the Russian, who was so instrumental, or the fellow of Russian heritage, I should say,
Yeah.
really, who was so instrumental in making the Corvette become the car it became. Then there's the stories of what you call the also rans, Tucker, the Kaiser Frazer, the Nash, the Hudson Hornet, the Edsel, the famous Edsel. You tell the Corvair, you tell all of these stories, uh, and you draw most of these as well. And just in the interest of time, I'm not going to. And many cars, which we don't, micro cars, which are famous in Europe, that we don't really have, are only really beginning, I guess, to come here now. I do have to ask, because you do end talking about Tesla, one of the most popular cars in the world. I have to ask what you think about the design of the Tesla Cybertruck.
Uh, I didn't give it a lot of thought, mostly because I sort of blocked trucks out of my out
Yeah,
of my vision because once I decided not to deal with them. But uh, I it's so I'm these are purely. I've never driven in one, or
sure.
I've barely seen them. I think there
Yeah.
aren't a lot where I live, but
Hmm.
uh, I mean, what strikes me, one is that stainless steel seems like a weird material for a for a car because it's aluminum makes a lot of sense for a car because it's light and it doesn't rust. As an old Canadian, I mean, rust was the enemy, and there was just nothing. You couldn't have a car for any extended period of time in Canada unless you kept it in a garage all winter. So you had to have
Hmm.
two cars. But
Hmm.
so stainless steel strikes me as a strange choice because you get a dent, and it's all very complicated and expensive. And uh, I mean, aesthetically, I can't say it doesn't attract me very much. But
Hmm.
so it's a strange thing. It does it's I mean, one of the things I learned in writing the book is to launch a new car, the odds of doing that successfully are extremely small
Hmm.
because the history of cars is all about the failures of people who come
Hmm.
in and try to launch a car. So to launch a car and have it the best-selling car in the world within a couple of years, as Tesla was, is
Hmm.
just an extraordinary achievement. And it hasn't happened. I mean, you have to go back to sort of Henry Ford and Chrysler to
Hmm.
get comparables because it's just an amazing story. Um, I think he struck out with the the truck. I don't see any kind of influence that it's having on other on other manufacturers. So I don't know. I
Hmm.
could be quite wrong about that. As I said, I've driven. I spent a summer working on something where we drove a pickup truck, and I enjoyed driving it, I must say. But it was I've never owned a pickup truck, so I haven't really had that kind of experience myself. But as I said, the Tesla is an amazing car story to pull it all together. And I'm not, as I said, it's kind of a next generation car. So it's not a car that I would ever, I don't have a car now, but I wouldn't consider buying one. It just has too many things that huge screen, I think, is kind of silly. I think the controls of cars have developed, and I wrote about this in a blog, not in the book, but when I was driving my car, I could touch all these controls without looking. I could change a station, preset station. I could adjust the volume, and I could just press a button and something would happen. Whereas on a screen, there's several things you do if you want to do something. It's not just, you don't just press one thing. You have to. It's like when you're at your computer, it takes you several keystrokes to get where you're going. That doesn't sound to me like either a safe or a practical or a pleasurable way to do things. It's just, and in cars, all these controls took a while to develop. And the idea that you can sort of overnight say, oh no, we've got a better solution and this is it. It's very unlikely that it is it. And sort of the ergonomics of putting everything on a screen seems wrong to me. And I don't think that's just kind of nostalgia. I think that the buttons and levers and knobs were actually a good way to do it, and it did take a while to work it all out, because I remember when I talk about this, when we rented this Renault when I was a student, we drove across Europe, and there was this thing, I couldn't find the gear shift, and there was this weird thing sticking out of the dashboard, and that was the gear shift, because they put it in a different place. It wasn't on the floor. It wasn't on the steering column. It was coming out of of course, it makes a lot of sense. A lot of French cars do that, because then the control just went straight into the engine at the right height, and it was just a very inexpensive way to deal with changing gears. But it was odd, and it certainly hasn't caught on. I mean, I don't think I can think of other cars. I'm sure there are some, but I can't think of other cars that adopted that. And so I think some aspects, I dislike the door handles on Teslas. I think I always feel it's gonna come off in my hand. It's probably quite solid, but just it doesn't fit my hand. It's this kind of, it's like a pencil or something. So there are a number of things like that which because I finished talking about the Mercedes, and the person in charge, who wasn't an Italian engineer, and everything that was done on it was done with a thought. It wasn't styling. It had to do with safety, or especially safety, but also kind of practicality and long life, because they were building a car that was going to last at least, I mean, ours lasted 25 years, and it's, as far as I know, it's still running, the person I sold it to. So things had to be thought out with a much longer life than sort of 10 years, which is probably what most cars last. And then things they're not meant to last longer than that.
Just a few last questions. I think I'm correct in saying you no longer own a car. Is that correct?
That's right. Our car died literally the day before we moved. We decided to downsize. We had a large house in Chestnut Hill, which is a old railroad suburb of Philadelphia, and we decided we wanted a smaller place in town. And the car died just literally the day before we moved. I had to rent a car to be able to get downtown, and And when we realized we just didn't need it, we were walking. My wife, who was very practical, pointed out that my reflexes were not what they used to be, and that, and she'd never liked cars particularly. I mean, she liked, as I wrote in the book, she loved the little Italian car we had, which was a sort of mini made in Italy. But she always would say, it would be wonderful to have a chauffeur, and then you would just call up and he would show up and take you wherever you wanted to go. So she was very happy when we got rid of it, and I just got used to it very quickly. I mean, I can't decide I'm going to drive to the shore, for instance, the Jersey Shore, because that's just too far to go in an Uber. But most places I need to go, I can get there with Uber, and I don't sort of miss it. And also, since I don't particularly like most of the cars, I would have to find some beautifully rebuilt older car.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then I realized I really don't want to do all that work anymore. Because the one thing about the cars in the 60s, you spend an awful lot of time keeping it going.
Mm-hmm.
Especially in Canada, it's cold winters and freezing temperatures, and you had to have a block heater to keep the engine from freezing up, and then before fuel injection, starting cars in the winter was a whole kind of, you never knew if it would start or not. Mm-hmm. And so, but of course that was simply what you took it for granted. That was what it meant to have a car. You had to do all these things, and there was a lot of maintenance and a lot of fussing, and I don't think I'd want that anymore.
I just want to talk real quick about process of writing. I read in one of your blogs, I think that you compose on a MacBook Air computer.
Yes.
Where do you write? When do you write? What time of day? What works best for you as a writer?
Usually the first thing in the morning, which many writers do. Although some people work late at night, I don't do that. But I do. It's usually in the morning, and I have a work area. I mean, a desk, and what has changed is I retired from teaching about a dozen years ago, and one of the things that's changed is that I used to have to sort of squeeze the writing in, and so if I had a free morning, it was like, great, I can work on that. But I had other things I was teaching, and I had other things that I had to do. Whereas when you retire, I can write as long as I feel like.
Yeah. So when you say morning, what time of day? Early?
Yeah,
7, 8, 9?
Well, we lived in the country for the longest time, so I just got in the habit of getting up at 6 o'clock. That's when I get up,
mm-hmm.
And so it's sort of 7 to 10 or 11 is sort of the time when I do most of my writing.
Well, I want to be mindful of your time. I can't recommend this book enough. It's called The Driving Machine, A Design History of the Car, published by W.W. Norton. It's been out since October. The author is Witold Rybczynski. Thank you so much for coming on and talking about this. It's been an honor to have you on here, and I wish you continued success and good luck with this project and all the others you work on.
Well, thank you, Stan. It was a pleasure.
My thanks to Witold Rybczynski for joining me on this podcast. You can find out more about his book at www.norton.com and at his website, witoldrybczynski.com. That's WITOLDRYBCZYNSKI, witoldrybczynski.com. The hardest working producer and engineer in show business, the producer of this podcast, the czar of our Tallahassee office, as well as the captain of the Off the Beaten Path Reel, Ale, Wobble, and Ramble team, is our very own and indispensable Brendan Cannonball Crellin. All guest accommodations on Off the Beaten Path provided by the Horseshoe Road Inn. Our Off the Beaten Path fact checker is Ella Fino. The director of accounts payable is Bill Schroeder. Our automotive medical researcher is Denton Fender. Our director of employee loyalty is Upton Leftus. Our staff layoff specialist is Harry Verderci, assisted by layoff counselor Oscar LaVista. The Off the Beaten Path figure skating coach is Landon McKeister. The staff physicist is Momentum. Our Russian chauffeur is Pick Up and Drop Off. Our financial advisors are provided by the firm of Ilgot and Gaines. Our staff bus driver is Bored and Drowsy. The Off the Beaten Path nightclub manager is Don Cashane. Our in-house literary critic is Al Ligori. The holiday wardrobe consultant is Don Wienow. Our staff director of Three Stooges Studies is Lee Iapocca. Dr. Todd Gross's personal eBay specialist is Selma Junkoff. And our Off the Beaten Path martini mixer, thank you very much, is Olive Twist. You can find our podcast anywhere you can find podcasts, including on YouTube and YouTube Music. You can also find Off the Beaten Path on the podcast app on your phone, and I would ask you to please leave a review on the Apple Podcast app. That would be most appreciated and helpful. Be sure and like Off the Beaten Path on Facebook as well. Learn everything about the Georgia Historical Society at georgiahistory.com and the Georgia History Festival at georgiahistoryfestival.org. Please also visit the official Off the Beaten Path website at deatonpath.georgiahistory.com and check out my videos, my blog, and similar rack and pinion podcasts like this one. Stay safe, stay strong. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. As always, thank you for listening.